Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Disrupting Mobility Summit. Please welcome Greg Lindsay from the New Cities Foundation.
Thank you, everyone. Welcome back to day 2, in which I will wear a lot less green than I did yesterday. But thank you all. Thank you all for coming out bright and early, 8:30 Friday. There's a famous joke in Business Week once pointed out that, that people never show up for the last day of a conference, even if it's the second day. So I salute you for bucking that trend and coming to join us for the final installment of Disrupting Mobility. This morning, of course, we're going to have a few more sessions, which I will moderate one after this. And then this afternoon, we will adjourn after lunch for tours around various institutions around Boston and Cambridge. And yeah, then we will call it a year, I suppose. So it's my distinct privilege to start off our second day by introducing the moderator of our next session, Tim Papandreou from the city of San Francisco. Tim, please come on up.
Good morning, everyone. Wow, these lights are bright. I've seen dimmer courtrooms under a subpoena. Jeez. This happens sometimes when you work in cities. You know, this is a big deal. I want to thank everyone for organizing this, and thank you to the universities for putting all this together. And we've had some really interesting discussions over the last day or so. And you know, a lot of the information that we've been hearing has been about all of the different changes that are happening and how we need to all either get on board or move on, you know, and I think it's a very interesting situation here. So in this morning session, we're going to cover shared use mobility and the sharing economy, basically what's happening in this whole space, and then how do we actually move it from a higher level discussion to actually implementation. And you'll see the theme throughout this whole morning's presentation is about cities, because the federal governments and the state governments can say a lot of this stuff and talk, but it's implementation that happens on the ground, and that's where cities come into play. And without cities, this doesn't actually work. And many of the blue sky thinking we had yesterday was fantastic. It needs city cooperation for it to actuate. And so many ideas live and die in cities. And so we want to make them live and thrive. And I want to give a little cautionary tale of that if you do ignore cities, cities do bite back. And if you may have noticed, those who are old enough to remember the Segway in the late 90s, it promised to revolutionize mobility and get us everywhere from everywhere in the most convenient, you know, easiest way. And they were banned from sidewalks because of the arrogance of that company. So you really need to be a partner in this, and we'll be talking more about it there. So I'm going to give a little bit of an overview of what we're talking about right now, and then I'm going to invite my esteemed panel to come on, and we'll share some stories and some ideas and some questions, and then I promise there'll be time for us to actually have a dialogue, because we haven't really had much of that so far, and so they're not going to give any presentations, we're just going to smoothly walk through this whole thing. So just to start, this is what we're talking about when we're talking about mobility and in cities. It's about people, right? And we've mentioned that before a few times, but we actually haven't shown people in a lot of our slides. We've shown a lot of computers and gadgets and things, but we're actually people. So this is actually what we like to do. We like to socialize, we like to do commerce, we like to enjoy stuff, share things. There are stand-up poets in this scene. There are people, you know, philosophizing about stuff and whatever. And then there's the seat of governance in the background. So you know, there's a really nice play. There's a nice scale, human scale design. There are trees, there's walking, there's not much noise from cars, etc. It's a really beautiful experience. So today we have our panel here, and I'm going to just walk through them very quickly. They're going to introduce themselves because they know themselves better than I do, even though I know them quite well. We've actually worked on a lot of things very well together. But we have a nice array of people from the sharing economy space. We have Emily Castor from Lyft, Matt George from Bridj, Justin Holmes from Zipcar, Bob Burns from B-Cycle, and Steve Carroll from RideScout, and we have Amanda Eaken from the NRDC. And you say, why is she on this panel? Well, I'll tell you why. Because she's making a lot of things happen for this space. So, and she's got great insights. She was one of the original authors of a seminal piece of legislation in the state of California that is allowing us to really think more holistically about our transportation and land use choices. I was also part of that as well, which is really fun. So this is what we're always promised when we're told and look about cars. And most of the universities present today have done a lot of work to get us to this space. And it's always filmed in California. It's on some beautiful road. The car gives you this exhilaration feeling. There's every tag you can think of that the car actually has. And then when you buy it, this is what you get. Truth in advertising, like what's going on? And I really want to underscore that we've focused so much on trying to reduce this congestion, and we really have missed the point. It's about having people access and people mobility. And even in this discussion here, we talk about, well, if we just had electric cars, things would be better. So I'm going to change the slide now and show what this looks like with electric cars. I just changed the slide. Right? It's not just about electric cars. It's part of the solution, but it's not just part of that. And then we talk about autonomous cars as well, and how autonomous cars are going to do all this cool stuff and blah, blah, blah. And they probably will, but I'm going to change the slide again. Right? If we don't get this sharing piece right, it ain't going to happen. We're going to have more of this, and we don't want that. So this is our problem, folks. We have these enormously oversized machines that are 80% empty, 95% stationary, and then 100% privately owned. That is not the right ingredient to make a great city. It's incompatible software and hardware for the code of the city. It just does not fit. And so we need to change that. And this is probably what a lot of people remembered socializing. Those of you who were around in the 70s, these were my parents, by the way, who were like socializing and stuff. It was all done in the car. Everything was about the car, like going out with your friends and all that stuff. Some of us were conceived in the back of cars. So it's like, this is a cultural thing that's been around. But it was actually created for us. We never had a love affair with the automobile. It was actually a manufactured forced marriage with the love affair of the automobile. We never actually had this. And we look at it and think, wow, that's so different. This is what the social scene looks like today, right? People looking at their smartphones, waiting for a train. The whole concept of our mobility and social experience has completely changed. And if we're not careful, we're going to end up like this, where no one's paying attention to anything and nothing's getting done. And so maybe that's when we do need it to have automation, full automation. But we need to figure this. There's a happy space in between. And this is the biggest fear of our generations right now. It's like shitty Wi-Fi, slow loading apps, and who gets that personal panic when there's a red bar on your phone? You're like, how am I going to plug in, right? So MIT and all the other cool labs, we need like Wi-Fi power. Like I know you're working on it, but let's move it going. So these are the kind of things that give us anxiety now. And before we get all nostalgic about, oh, it was so much better back in the old days, commuting was so much more enjoyable, blah, 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 all this sort of stuff. The smartphones and the tablets and things are not a really new phenomenon when you're looking at commuting, because this is how people used to commute, right? Very antisocial. It was not a happy place. And so the promise of shared mobility and the whole sharing system is that we could actually have a different experience. We could actually have a more enjoyable experience. Who has a really awesome commute every morning to work? It's like, wow, that was fantastic. I feel so good. That is the exception, guys. But it's still very small. Who's like, so, whatever, and then someone's like, oh God, what happened this morning? Okay, somewhere in the middle. So, why is this happening? Well, because a lot of stuff has happened all at the same time. So, a lot of the technologies come in from all different spaces, Wi-Fi, 3G, all these different things, and all this information they've been integrating on their own. This is a slide I created in 2010 that was showing how we're basically merging all this information. And this is what's allowed us to have a lot of this shared mobility. And I think it's important to know that we need a lot of these background systems for it to work. And I think the sharing economy itself, as Susan mentioned yesterday and others have mentioned before, access is trumping ownership, but the experience is actually what's the most important thing. It's having a really consistently good experience from end to end. That's what people actually like to have. And so that's what's been really important on this. Now, imagine if commuting was fun. I mean, imagine if it was one of the most fun part of your day, like it was the most enjoyable part of your day. We've been so heavy yesterday on like, oh, the future, this, that, blah, blah. If we don't make it fun, no one's going to do this, right? It's got to be fun. And putting fun, I can tell you, because we've done a lot of surveys, driving, taking public transport, and even taking taxi and shared mobility and the TNCs, people don't say it's a fun experience all the time. Walking and cycling is fun, right? People say, I'm happy. I actually got some exercise. I feel good. So we need to integrate that into the experience. So, you know, and I think that bike sharing has been one of the consistent respondents where they say, this is the most funnest thing I've ever done in commuting in like forever. So, in that way, in California, you know. So, I sounded really LA right now, sorry, but that's how it is. So I'm going to do a little exercise with you guys. I'm going to have you just in this next 30 seconds, I'm going to have you to look to your left or to your right and introduce yourself and just say who you are, just really quickly. Just do it right now. Okay. Have we said our hellos? Yeah, we have. All right. Okay, let's focus back. Let's focus back. Okay. See how social that was? That was really interesting, right? Now, I'm going to ask you guys to do this again now. Imagine the person that you just introduced yourself to is a long-lost friend. And I'm going to ask you to do two things. Really say hello and like, wow, I'm so happy to see you. And if you have a Twitter account, take a selfie and post it on the DMO 2015 hashtag. Let's go. Let's go. All right. Okay, everybody had that? So you just had your happy commute, you posted it on Twitter, and that is the promise of shared use mobility, is that it's going to be fun. It is fun for those of you already doing it. It's fun, it's social, you actually meet people, you have conversations, and who knows, other things happen. But like, I think it's I'm not going to stop it there. It's going to be fun. So, what we're talking about, though, when we're talking about this, is really a change in policy norms and a shifting in transportation policy. And so you look at those three things. So what you just experienced when you first sat down next to a stranger was kind of like your typical commute. When you had this introduction, that was kind of like the entree into this. And then when you had that, hey, it was kind of like, this is how we actually can make this work. And so traditionally, we've had people own their own transport and do their own thing. Right now, we're trending with some people having their own transport and some of the people actually starting to share their services, share their choices. But very soon, we're going to have this model where no one's really want to own their car because they actually want to use these access options around the city. And it really is going to start in the city first because there is the land use intensity for this to happen first. It really does need the land use intensity to make it work. And I think it's really important to understand that because shared mobility doesn't happen in a vacuum. It actually needs good land use and good street design for actually to really function. And I think the interesting thing is that it's going to happen in the suburban areas if it hasn't already started, and it will happen in the rural areas in a very, very different form. But it still will be this concept of sharing rides and sharing services. What we're talking about here is just managing our excess capacity. And I think what cities are working with right now is a whole bunch of us working on this actually on how do we manage existing demand, how do we manage new demand through mode shift strategies before we have any more expansion, because expansion is really expensive. And so we want to figure out how do we actually optimize our existing networks. And what we're doing right now, in my new position as the head of innovation for the MTA, one of the things that I'm working on is to create a transportation platform. And it's a real shift in policy. You think innovation is challenging in the private sector? You should try innovation in the public sector. It's a different kettle of fish, as they say. So in this transportation platform, we're trying to figure out what is the role of the city? How do we actually do this? And we also are acknowledging, probably for the first time for many cities, that we have citizens who are customers. Customers. A customer has a service exchange. We want to meet their needs because we like to keep them as customers. So whether they're residents, workers, or visitors, pulling them together and saying they're customers is a very new perspective for the public sector. And then who are the mobility providers? Who provide the transport in the city? Well, the public sector provides a big chunk of it because they're managing the public transit system, the streets, the walking footpaths, the bicycle lanes, that sort of stuff. But there's also private providers as well, and a lot of them are going to come on the stage this morning. And then there are also employer providers who are providing a service, but it's not open to everybody. It's open to just their employees, and we know about those with the different tech shuttles. The third piece is the really important piece, and that's where I think a lot of the tech community here is absolutely essential in figuring this out, is how do we integrate all this stuff together? Because a lot of it's not talking to each other right now, and we'll discuss that in a little bit more, but at the very minimum, for this to actually work and scale, the routing has to work and be consistent as you look at this. The booking actually has to work. You actually have to book some sort of service. The payment has to work, and it has to work quickly. And there's already technology flaws that don't allow us to have quick payment on certain systems. And then the ability to unlock or lock the device that you're utilizing, whether it's a bike from a dock, a car, or whatever the service is that needs to be freed up so you can use it, that has to happen as well. And then there's so much opportunity. We haven't even talked about this at all today, yesterday or today, about gamification. We can really change behavior through all of these different types of games and incentives because we've done it in our different spaces, and it's been super effective, and the smartphone's been incredible at doing that. And then lastly, which is what the city is really the key partner on, is this all needs street space. How do we actually put this on the street? What's the right allocation of our spaces on our streets to make this actually work? And we're talking about stations, spots like locations, docks, all of this stuff is in the public right-of-way, and we need to think about what's the right mix, how does it actually fit? All cities are different and the systems will be different, but the spacing really determines whether people will use this or not. So you need a critical mass to make this actually work. And I think the interesting thing is that, in California, we at least have integrated transportation policy, and I'm going to have Amanda talk a little bit about this, but just to give you a flavor of it, we have all these different laws that we've passed that can bring us into doing more holistic land use transportation, energy, water, and waste management, and it's actually really working in California. It's actually working. So cities are actually doing this with the regional government, but the key issue is that a lot of the issues that we're talking about are regional in nature, and the traffic is really, no one's really accountable for the regional traffic. I don't understand why, but it baffles my mind why no one takes account of this is actually my responsibility. And so we need to change that. So For San Francisco, shared mobility is key to our success as a city. About 6 years ago, I was brought up from Los Angeles to create a strategic plan for the agency because they didn't have one. And the first thing that we did was collaborate with a whole bunch of people in the city and say, what do we actually want? We want a great city. No one wants a crappy city, right? We want a great city. But to have a great city, you need excellent transportation choices. And I mean excellent, not just okay, not just fair or whatever. They need to be excellent. And for us to get excellent choices, they need to be real choices. Like, I don't want to be given a choice of Diet Coke or Coke. I want orange juice. You know, it's a different category, even though it's owned by Minute Maid's owned by Coke. But still, you know what I'm saying? Like, maybe you want a latte. Like, you want something, you want real choices, you know, not just alternatives. And we need to get alternatives out of this lexicon of transportation. This is not an alternative, it's a different choice. Because it's really important for people when they see that. And when you look at this, you look at the top bar, the most important piece is the mixed land use plans, travel demand management, and parking and traffic management. We have no land use authority, but we know that without that, it's not going to work. Once you have that in place, now you're creating the demand, because that's what these systems need to work. And, you know, we supply with walkable streets and spaces. You can invest in local and regional transit networks. In some cities, they don't have that yet. So the other two on the side are much more important. You can have, you know, need a bicycle network that's interconnected. And then this is where the sharing economy really fits in, is vehicle sharing and shuttle partners. And partners, they actually need to be partners. And to do that, you need to set some goals as a city, like what do you actually want to see happen? We had a 62% total mode share of driving in 2011 and a 38% total mode share of non-driving. And our board gave us a goal of 50-50 by 2018. And to do that, we had to shift a lot of the policy norms in our city to actually make that happen, because we weren't actually given any more resources. So to do that, you know, we had to think about what kind of city do we want? And most cities that I speak with, you know, they want a city of short and frequent trips. No one wants to be traveling all the time everywhere. You want really short trips. To do that, you need to have really good street design and really good land uses. And this is the intensity of people walking in San Francisco with our models. And so you can see that the red areas are our financial district, and those yellow lines are all of our major transit corridors. So there is an intensity there. And I really want to underscore this. Like, you know, we met our goal 3 years early, so we were surprised by that. We actually met our 50-50 goal by 2015, which, you know, was a huge feat. You know, I mean, it was really, really, really surprised by that. Feel free to applaud. You know, no city's done that. And the reason we did that was because we collaborated with a lot of different partners to do this. It wasn't just the MTA, it was a whole bunch of people. But what we found very quickly was the landscape of things had changed. And, you know, now 25% of all trips were by public transit, 23% of trips were by walking, and 4% were a combination of bicycling, taxi, the TNCs, which we call them TNCs, but they're Uber and Lyft, and bike sharing and everything else. But what was interesting was we had actually gone over the 50% threshold for driving. Driving had come down to about 48% now. So that was interesting to see that. What was also interesting is because we had a lot of debates in our city about why we're spending so much money on public transport. We're actually, you know, the cities shouldn't be spending this much money. And data is really key to tell your story, because for $1 billion, we can move half of all the trips in the city. For the private sector to move the other 50%, it costs the consumers $3 billion. That's a really important fact to see that said that way. Now, autonomous vehicles will bring that down for sure, absolutely. But walking, cycling, and fixed guideway transit along the major capacity corridor areas, this is a system that works so well, you don't want to mess with that. You know, we've been having challenges with the emerging technology providers, you know, focusing on that group. Focus on the group on your left. That's who we want to work with. You know, that's where we want to get them down. And just from an efficiency perspective, 1,500 transit vehicles move a quarter of all the trips in the city. To do the same thing in the private cars, we've estimated we need 350,000 cars. That's just not compatible for city development. So in order for us to support our economic efficiency and competitiveness, we need to have more people on the right-hand side and less people on the left-hand side. And it's going to take some time, but we're going to do it. So shared mobility market is rapidly diversifying. You know, we have almost every mode of transportation in San Francisco anyway, but now we've got a whole bunch of shared mobility providers. And some of them are shown on this slide. We have traditionally public transport, van pooling, car sharing, Zipcar, bike sharing, but then the TNCs, you know, Lyft and Uber, peer-to-peer car sharing with GetAround, the corporate shuttles that run up and down to the Silicon Valley. We have scooter sharing in San Francisco. We have jitney services and different complementary jitney services, and we've got Matt George here from Bridj to show us a little bit more about that. We also have a whole bunch of other one-way car sharing operators that have moved into the space as well. You've got BMW Drive now and Car2Go. We also have TNCs for kids. We have Shuttle, and Shuttle is basically a by parents, for parents shared mobility service. We're starting a concept of taxi sharing. There is an overlay service that actually provides regional sharing throughout the corridors. We've also changed. These are changing quickly as well. Like those of you who remember relay rides, they're now called Turo, and they've changed their model because they want to move with the times. And then we just recently had our Scoot quads, which are under the Nissan badge, but there's folks from Renault here. This is their Twizy. It's in San Francisco. And that's this middle mode that's actually starting to do really well. We also have a purpose market shared mobility. Silver Ride, for example, the gentleman is from there, was talking about that yesterday. So all of these things are happening in real time, and there's many other ones that I could fit into the slides as well. So why is this important? Because it's a huge opportunity to change our economic costs with our transportation. In San Francisco alone, if we can reduce the rate of auto ownership and auto use and shift this towards shared mobility, we could reduce the auto fleet by 15 to 30%. That's massive. And then we can do this quickly if we can scale. That's a $5 billion plus opportunity. This is why everyone's clamoring to enter this space. Why is everyone so invested in this now? Because it's a huge opportunity. This is just San Francisco. We've got over 1 billion trips a day in the US, so multiply that, and then multiply that by in the world. This is like $1 trillion plus opportunity globally to get this. And so everyone's really, really going for this, which is going to be interesting. So as we talked this morning with our panel, we're going to go over these 4 key areas. How do we actually do this? So what's the governance role? What are our roles and responsibilities? How do we get this right? We need to move towards customer focus. How do we focus on the customer and get their needs met in this? And then how do we scale this? Because right now it's a very small area in cities. How do we scale this? And then what are the outcomes that we want? We actually can shape that together. So think of these as we go through this, and understand that we can get into these tug of wars. We've got into these tug of wars when we don't think about this properly. And the citizens are in the balance with this when we don't get this right. What we want is we want equity. We want this to be equitable, because equality and equity are not the same thing, as you know, right? So it's like we need to prop some things up that need to be propped up. We also need to make sure that it's fair for everyone. So our goal is to join the dots, make it fair, balance the goals, because we want to work as a team. I want team shared use mobility in cities. And the city on the left and the providers on the right, this is the partnership that we want to have, because it's really, and we've got to play by the rules. We really do, to make this work and make it work for everybody. And before we get into the panel, there's also this discussion of, do these meet the city livability goals? A lot of them do. Like these guys up, oops, sorry. I don't even go back. Whoops. So these guys up on the top here, if you walk, bicycle, bike share, public transport, we know that they meet our city goals because we have reams and reams of data that basically support that fact and shows us that they actually do. All at the bottom, the driver alone, we know that they don't support city goals because we have reams and reams of data and support to show that. And then in the middle there, at the bottom middle area where we've got taxis and TNCs and the shuttles, it's not clear yet. The jury's out. So as we talk more about data at the end of this is why we need to have this kind of data, so we can actually show. Our goal is to move all of those guys up into the green and say, yes, they meet our city livability goals, but without the data, we can't do that. We can't get there yet. And so when we're talking about shared mobility, we're talking about policy priority and principles. How do we make all of these principles actually work for shared mobility? That's really the key piece. And I'm going to show you an example of, we actually have done this. So this actually can be done. We've got the shuttle program in San Francisco, where there was a lot of protest by it. There was a lot of misinformation. But because of the data sharing agreement we had with all the corporate shuttle partners, we found that they did 2 things. They drastically reduced VMT along the corridor. They actually reduced congestion along the corridor. and people actually didn't need to buy cars. That's a big deal to have. That's a very powerful data statement to have. Now we're working with them as corporate partners, and we're having an agreement on where they can stop in the city, and it's actually working out pretty successfully. So you can do this. We actually can have these partnerships. It's not a lost cause. So I'm going to bring the panelists on the stage now, so we can actually have a conversation I'll give you the background, and I want to hear more from them about how it's working for them and what we're up to. So panelists, please come on the stage. Perfect, Amanda.
Gosh, these lights are bright.
Yeah, they are. So just really quickly, can you just go from end to end and just introduce yourselves? We know the drill about how we're supposed to introduce ourselves, like who I am, what I do, and why I'm here.
Perfect.
Go, Amanda.
So I'm Amanda Eaken with the Natural Resources Defense Council. I work for the Urban Solutions program of NRDC, and Urban Solutions is really focused on cutting carbon pollution, but in ways that focus on the basics of life and help to address some of the social equity concerns we've heard mentioned throughout this conference. Shared mobility is very interesting to us because we have some early data, mostly around round-trip car sharing, that suggests that people do reduce their carbon pollution when car sharing services are made available to them. So the average car share member, according to UC Berkeley research, cuts their carbon 30 to 40%, which makes sense because when you pay per use of the vehicle, you're much more judicious with the use of that resource. So, and then there are many other modes of shared mobility that we don't yet know the climate impacts of, and we need to do further research. But we also come at it from the equity perspective, thinking about people's lives. And we've all heard the number that cars are mostly empty, they're mostly underutilized. They cost us $9,000 a year. Median income in the country is $53,000. We've been digging into this data a little bit, and for families that live at the poverty level in the United States, and for a family of 4, that's about $25,000 a year. And just for context, that's about 1 in 5 families in Los Angeles, a place we do a lot of work. For those families, you'd think, well, then, they're going to make a decision to not own a vehicle. But for those families making $25,000 a year, 40% of those families own 2 vehicles. This blows my mind. How the math, how the household economics work out, I don't know. But if we can, through shared mobility, open up opportunities not just for people to cut their carbon pollution, but to really reduce the household transportation cost, that's going to be hitting both of our goals for Urban Solutions.
Well, my name is Bob Burns. I'm with B-Cycle. B-Cycle is a bike sharing company. We put our first system in Denver in April of 2010, and we're now in about 41 communities around the United States and in Santiago, Chile. So I'm here to try and maybe steer a little bit of the conversation towards bike share. I think as Tim's slide showed, bike share was pretty high up there on the city livability goals. And one of the things that I'd like to talk a little bit about today, if we get the opportunity, is what is bike share? What should bike share be? We're really in the wild, wild west. There are a lot of different business models. And what is the right level of public-private partnership to help make bike sharing a reality, not just in the big cities where large sponsors are interested in putting their logos on the kiosks, but in a lot of the smaller and medium-sized cities like San Antonio or Tucson or Boulder or Houston, or for that matter, Spartanburg, right? How do we get bike sharing in communities like that as well?
Thanks, Bob.
Great. Good morning. Justin Holmes from Zipcar. Zipcar, as many of you probably know, is the world's leading car-sharing network. We enable our members spontaneous access or planned access to vehicles by the hour, by the day. We were an early pioneer in the sharing economy. We were founded actually here in Cambridge, not incredibly long ago, 15 years ago, just down the road in Central Square. And today we have a network of over 1 million members, nearly 1 million members worldwide who share over 10,000 vehicles in 7 countries and over 500 cities and towns and over 500 college and university campuses. And some of the things that we've learned in our 15 years of operations is that one, we can't do it alone. If our goal is to enable people to live simply and responsibly in urban areas, we thrive off a greater ecosystem of public transportation and public mobility options. As Tim articulated, bike sharing, TNCs, all enable people to live car-free or car-light. And we think Zipcar has proven to be a nudge that will ultimately get more people out of the personally owned vehicle. So we've learned that partnerships are incredibly important to the future success of our business, but also to the future success of cities.
Thank you. Steve?
Good morning. My name is Steve Carroll from RideScout. It's great to be here today. See, the company's been around about 3 years, and for those of you who've used RideScout, we're in about 90 cities now. In its current version, we're kind of the kayak of ground transportation. We started RideScout about 3 years ago with the goal of making some impact on reducing SOVs. I used to take Tim's slides and make them my own. They're a great introduction to what we wanted to do. And density is a huge problem. Emily understands that, and making dynamic, real-time ride sharing work, because I think is really one of the big solutions to a lot of our problems. We approached it by trying to replicate the reliability and flexibility of owning your own car by putting all of the ride choices that are available to you in one place, just giving you price, time, arrival, and allow you to make the choice, and connect to those rides. And so about a year ago, we began to transition out of kind of just an information piece into adding additional book pay and access functionality, something else that Tim mentioned earlier. And along the way, have grown a little bit with the acquisition of Globe Sherpa Mobile Ticketing, which is a big part of that. And now we're kind of really excited with some new technology to build kind of the technological fabric, a network, if you will, to allow all of these great alternative modes. Choices. Just wanted to see if I could get a reaction from Tim.
To
connect seamlessly with one account and for a much better user experience. And so, yeah, that's it.
Right. Emily, Lyft.
Great. I'm Emily Castor. I'm the Director of Transportation Policy at Lyft. I'm also the biggest shared mobility enthusiast that you could find. I've known Tim for almost 4 years now, and I came into this space as really a sharing economy omnivore. I was using the predecessor to Lyft, which was Zimride. It was an online carpooling platform for college and university students around the country, started about 8 years ago, where we were trying to match up people going the same way on long-distance routes, because we were struck by that fact that Tim mentioned, that 80% of seats in cars are empty, and that's an incredible waste of inventory that we have in our transportation system that's moving around on our streets every day that we could be leveraging using technology to match up people. But this idea of dynamic carpooling is something that really, smart transportation demand management professionals have worked to address for a long time. And yet, in the last 20 years, we've seen carpooling actually cut in half in this country. So we wanted to try to find a way to come at that problem from a different angle, and frankly an unorthodox angle that started out by us having to build up an on-demand network in a non-carpooling capacity. But the end goal is always something that we've had very firmly in mind, and it really goes back to our founders being inspired by the ad hoc transportation networks of places like Zimbabwe and the developing world, where people come together in organic arrangements to try to make the most efficient use of the limited resources that they have in the transportation system. And then also by the experience of Logan, one of our founders, in Santa Barbara in California, where he actually was elected to the transit board as a bus rider activist. He was in college, he didn't own a car in Southern California, and he was trying to make that livable, and no one else on the transit board was a bus rider. And so he was sort of actually nominated by the community of folks who wanted to have their needs reflected in the service planning decisions that were made, and he struggled so hard to find a way to bring bus transit in frequent enough headways to make it possible for people to get that way around Santa Barbara, and it just couldn't work at the level of service that was needed. And so he thought, how can we use transit to actually supplement that? And so that's what we now are really focusing on, using this network that we've built to create, is making it a complementary aspect of the broader transportation system. We don't think that we're going to build the world we want if everyone takes a Lyft for every trip. Instead, we want to work with all of these other shared modes to create an environment in which people can rely on the fact that they'll always have a sustainable mode and a shared mode to get them where they need to go, and that public transit will continue to be the backbone of that system, and that we need simultaneous investment in public transit to expand capacity for people to get at the regional level, while having flexible options to lead into that network.
Matt, the guy who's the glue in between all of us.
I know, yeah, no. So at the end of the day, my name is Matt, I'm CEO of Bridj, based here in the greatest city in the world, Boston, Massachusetts.
Yay. Great.
It's the greatest city in the world.
Come on, all right, there we go.
Good morning.
Yeah, I know, Jesus, guys. So at the end of the day, what we do at Bridj is we essentially are sort of the national leader in sort of what Susan now has deemed and has taken off, Susan, she came from Berkeley, has deemed sort of the micro-transit space. And we've embraced that. So we essentially provide a shuttle bus network that doesn't have routes, it doesn't have schedules that are available to the public. So we look at an incredible amount of data to be able to understand both retrospective and prospective demand patterns for cities, and essentially sort of create a back-end transportation network that a user accesses on their cell phone and says, hi, my name is Matt, I'm at point A, and I need to go to point B. Unlike, sort of traditional transit where you are directed to sort of a fixed stop with a sort of a headway, or a TNC where a vehicle comes and picks you up directly, we're somewhere in the middle. We tell you to go walk to a stop that we've picked as essentially sort of the mathematical center based on the demand pattern, based on that day or based on sort of that area, and we're directing everybody else in your neighborhood to go to that same spot. A vehicle is hopefully pre-deployed to be able to come and get y'all, and picks you up, expresses, drops off, and then everybody walks the last 5 to 10 minutes themselves. So for our users, we promise them 3 things. The first is that we're never going to pick them up exactly where they are. The second thing is we're going to pick them up within a 5-minute walk of where they are. And the third thing is that we're going to provide them a direct car-like trip once they're on the vehicle. So it really is something sort of in the middle. We've deployed the system to sort of great success here in Boston. We're doubling our size about every 2.5 months. We're also in Washington, D.C., and soon to be Kansas City, Missouri, which we're really excited about. So that's us.
Excellent. Great overview from all of our providers and our policy expert here. And she's an expert, really, really valuable. So I'm going to run through some of these areas so we can have a bit of a discussion, and then we're going to open it up to the floor to have a conversation about this. Because I know a lot of you have a lot of ideas and opinions on how we can actually move this forward, so we really want to have a dialogue. So on the first piece I went through on the governance, which was we're getting these policy tug-of-wars, and we know the situation we've had with, especially with TNCs. We actually had this same tug-of-war with car sharing a decade ago, and we had this same arm wrestle with bike sharing. Cities need to learn and adopt and evolve, and it does take some time. And so I want to throw it to the floor there. What's been your hardest experience working with cities to try and get some change happening in this space? Whether it's been directly with the city or whether you've worked on behalf of a group, what's been the toughest challenge or the thing that you found that struck you in this deliberation?
I think the most,
Emily out first.
I've been through the trenches on this for sure. I started at Lyft the first week that we launched 3.5 years ago, and at that time there was no jurisdiction in the world that had a category for what we did. We were blurring the lines in the way that an individual could use personal vehicles for quasi-commercial purposes, and yet do that on a part-time basis that didn't require them to become a professional. And that really broke the mold. Oh. And so it was challenging to come and ask for new models to be created for that. But that really was the way we approached it, was to ask and to start a dialogue with cities and to try to do that collaboratively and say, hey, look, there's this thing that we've built that people really love using. And we know that it's going to help achieve a lot of the goals that you have as a city or as a state, and that there isn't currently a box that fits for us. But let's start talking about what the objectives are of policy for regulation for this, and figure out a creative way to get there. The existing categories aren't going to work, but if we start from scratch and look at the desired end, we believe we can get to a place where we meet the public safety goals, we meet the equity goals, we have appropriate insurance coverage for this, and we've been able to achieve that now in over half the states around the country and many cities in a very rapid period of time. I think the most challenging environment is when sort of there's not that openness from the city to look at a different category. But now I think there's convergence around the idea that new categories are needed, and a growing consensus around what that model can look like.
Justin, I mean, you guys really started this, disruption in city space. Give us some of your experience.
Yeah, I think for me, I actually started my career in city government, so I can appreciate both sides of Tim's tug of war. You know, I think, 10 or 15 years ago, the situation, of course, was very different for us, right? As a new category, many cities, many states, many jurisdictions thought car sharing was just like car rental, right? And still in some places, we have policies that are outliers where we sin tax things like car sharing, like we do alcohol, like we do cigarettes, where I think that we still need some evolving to do. But I think today, we're very fortunate that we've evolved past many of that, where we see cities as partners. And one of the strongest enablers of that has been data, right? And by opening up our data and sharing it with researchers like Susan from UC Berkeley, we've been able to derive really great insights about how powerful an impact car sharing can be in cities. And so using that data and solid research as a catalyst, we've been able to form incredibly strong partnerships with cities. That's today. I think tomorrow, as you point out, Tim, that if cities are partners today, they will be our platforms of tomorrow, right? And I think really enabling us, really catalyzing many of these services, using the data that we ultimately will, I hope more providers will open up to you, will build a stronger, more vibrant ecosystem.
Amanda and then Bob.
Yeah, I just want to come at this from a little bit more global perspective and think about why shared mobility, isn't taking off, as fast as it could and could go faster. And that really goes to just thinking about all of the ways that the paradigm of individual private car ownership has embedded itself into all of our structures and systems. And that there are just cues and messages everywhere you look in policy, in the built environment, that you should own your own car and that you should drive your own car. I think about things like the federal commuter subsidy for parking, which is more money than we incentivize people to transit. We incentivize them to drive alone to work, and we give them a tax benefit, and I think that is just completely crazy. Think about parking requirements for new developments. Think about all the different ways that this sends a message. So I think kind of the good news is that we've been starting to tackle these things one by one. Tim mentioned the structure of Senate Bill 375 in California. That was really our land use, transportation, and climate framework that essentially sends a message that we need to reduce vehicle miles traveled. So we've been thinking about how we can reduce vehicle miles traveled and how we can get at some of these systemic incentives for you to drive alone. One of the ways that we were able to tackle that was our Environmental Quality Act, CEQA. It's known around the world as the premier Environmental Quality Act. The way it was measuring transportation impacts from new projects, whether a bike lane, whether a mixed-use infill development, whether a BRT project, was something called level of service, which is basically delay to automobiles. So if your bike lane would cause delay to automobiles, you've got to do an expensive study, and maybe you can't build it at all. Same thing with your bus rapid transit lane.
Or you get sued.
Or you get sued and you stop your bike plan entirely for several years.
Yeah.
So we were able to change that in law. And we were able to say, this is crazy, it's 2014, and we need a new way of doing things. And so now the new way is going to be, the goal is going to be the reduction of vehicle miles traveled. So does a bike lane cause an increase in vehicle miles traveled? No, it simply does not. So we can go ahead with those projects. And I think there are just so many examples of the ways that we need to move away from that that paradigm of personal vehicle ownership.
Bob?
So can we talk about bikes for a minute?
Yes.
I mean, car sharing is great, but we're still talking about cars, right? And I think bike sharing was really high up on your scale. So bike sharing has been pretty interesting because it really only began in this country 5 years ago. and we're still figuring it out. But by definition, bike sharing is a public-private partnership. We're invited to cities. We have to go through the municipal procurement process, which is a bitch, right? But once you're past that, we don't just sneak in like certain hail services, right? I mean, we have to go through the whole process. So you're invited by the city, but once you're there, the biggest, I think, challenge that we face is getting butts on bikes, right? So a common metric in bike sharing is rides per bike per day. And so while we talk about vehicle miles traveled as a bad thing, rides per bike per day is a good thing. And what we really need to do in cities is to take, the way you do that is through integration. That's really what I think. And the reason why I say that is because we have this little bike share system in little Fargo, North Dakota, of all places. And in Fargo, they put in a B-cycle system, and it was the students in the university that really were behind it. And they used the student ID card as the fair access media. And when students sign up to go to school in Fargo, $15 goes on their little student activity fee, and then they have unlimited use of the bike share system. So with 100 bikes in Fargo, they have exceeded 20 trips per bike per day in Fargo, North Dakota. So you can give a big round of applause for that, because
Yeah, Fargo.
that is, according to Russell, our expert, that is a North American record. So what I'm really excited about is this. This is an LA tap card. And B-Cycle is going into downtown LA next year, and we are using for the first time a major metropolitan transit agency's fair access media, as this will be the access media for the bike share system in LA. And what bike share systems really need more than revenue, more than anything else, is uptake. We need to get butts on bikes, because when you get more people on bikes, not only do you achieve all of the things that the cities want to achieve, but you build a base of public support for safe bicycling infrastructure. Bike sharing gets people on bikes that haven't been on bikes in 10, 15 years. They go out with their friends for lunch, and they get on a bike share bike, and then all of a sudden, they're riding their bike again. And what we really need to do, the biggest challenge with cities, is for us to work together to get butts on bikes.
Excellent. Okay, so that's actually a good segue to the next question. So as these services are maturing and evolving in the center cities, how do we broaden this shared use mobility to become more mainstream? Right now, it's less than 1% of all trips in most city centers, city areas. And it's a very particular demographic. You know, Susan Shaheen's got the data on that, on like who's predominantly using this sort of stuff. It tends to be more affluent people, more mobile savvy, all that sort of stuff. How do we broaden that so that it becomes more mainstream? Thoughts?
I'll tell you just how we think about growth. I think there are three main drivers, three main enablers of growth for our company. First is density, and I think you talked, Tim, already about how powerful land use planning is in encouraging and nurturing so many of our services. The second for us is transit options, right? I won't say transit alternatives, but transit options. So greater investments in public transit and in bike sharing and in other modes that would better enable someone to build their personal mobility menu outside of personal vehicle ownership to choose our service. So we choose locations, we choose places that have a great network of transportation options. And lastly, we look at public policies. Do we have public partners that will come to the table with opportunities for us to grow? Whether that's like you've done in San Francisco, opening up highly visible curb space locations for us to establish, excuse me, car sharing as a norm, right? And so to Amanda's point, if we have given away so much of our public curb space really for free to personal vehicle ownership, shouldn't we be giving that investment to a technology, to a tool that is proven to align better with cities' goals? And so you and San Francisco have certainly done that. Cities and other places have as well. But I do think that is a critical element to helping us grow and scale, particularly outside of the downtown core.
Yeah, I'd like to see more pilot programs that when I was talking about the parking federal tax benefit, many companies provide that benefit, just free parking as a kind of a perk to their employees. And we have had a law in California called parking cash out for a while that employers are supposed to offer the cash value of the parking space or the parking space and allow that. It's been loosely implemented. It's not great. But what I'd love to see is for some sort of mobility option pilot. So rather than the parking space, you get a debit card that you could use for car sharing, you could use for transit, you could use for bike share, you could maybe use for ride sourcing TNC companies. There's one little pilot I'll flag, which was in California, we had the Charge Ahead campaign, which is all about electric vehicles. And a portion of that program incentivizes you. If you come in and you crush a vehicle, an old polluting vehicle, you get a rebate for doing such. It's substantial. It's $7,500 a year. And you can now, because we wrote in this mobility option to the legislation, you can use that money for car share. You can use it for transit. Not quite the full mobility menu right now, but more incentives that send a message to people that, we pay people all the time to go buy this car or that car. How about incentivizing people to not buy a car and instead to use the mobility options available to them? Could really start to send a message.
It's absolutely right that parking policy is intricately entwined with the success of all of our services. In fact, our founder's favorite book is Donald Shoup's The High Cost of Free Parking, right? Because if you think about how you decide how you're going to get where you need to go, if you own a car, you're doing the math in your head, and you're thinking about, if I drive into the city, how much am I going to pay for parking at the other end? And if it's $25 or $30, there are a lot of other options that I could use for that $30. But if it's $5, if it's $10, or if it's free, there are much fewer other options that are going to be able to come in under that dollar amount. So for Lyft, I think free parking is something that will be really challenging to our growth outside of really dense urban areas. And that the decisions by policymakers to do the hard task of actually, reducing access to free parking in cities. You look at a city like San Francisco, 68% of households still own a car. Blows my mind. It's such low-hanging fruit in terms of access to shared mobility and other options, and yet street parking is still free. And I used to have a car in San Francisco when I lived there and move it around, from one street parking space to another. And there are a lot of people that do that dance. Let's make that harder and make it easier to use these other options, because it probably will actually save people money.
I actually own a car and I really like it, and I only get to drive it on Saturdays and Sundays because I'm traveling most of the time. I'm using public transit and Lyft primarily, and I enjoy it. There's no doubt the incentives are the most important thing, but the technology has to keep enabling an improved experience, and I think that's where we're all headed. Most of the companies work very hard on their own individual experience on their mobile apps, but it's about, we've got to get it out to the greater public. And to your point, Amanda, the incentives are key. We've got to make it easier, for example, not for just cities to incentivize citizens, but for employers to incentivize their employees, and the cities can make an impact there. They down in California, they're doing that, and make mobility benefits a strong driver of moving people out of their cars and into the other options that are available. And I think we're very close to that today. And I think the RideTap network that we're building with a single account access at RideScout is going to help do that with a single source, single funding account that can be easily subsidized by employers or cities.
I think that's a really important point. It's just that we do talk a lot about it. We've talked a lot about incentives, but we do actually need to do some sticks as well. We really have to make it clear that this is what we want to see happen, especially in our cities, but also in the regional corridors where most of the city traffic is actually coming from. In the city of San Francisco and other cities like us, probably Boston as well, not much of the traffic that's moving around is really from locally generated. There is definitely part of it, but a lot of it is suburban coming in because the choices out there are not good enough. And so I want to ask this question, how do you do this in the suburbs? How do you actually do this in the suburbs? Because I'll give you an example. Right now, there's a lot of people who live in the suburban areas of San Francisco. They do want to take the regional train in, but the parking lot's full at 7 o'clock. For many reasons. It's not priced properly. There shouldn't even be parking lots, in my opinion, but there are, because there's bad land uses out there, whatever the story is, right? But the thing is, they can't come in, and if they do want to come in with shared mobility, right now it's just too expensive for them on a daily budget. It exceeds their daily budget. So how do we make this work in the suburbs? What's the best way to do it?
So I think the other way to expand that question, Tim, that we sort of skirted on but didn't really address because it sort of makes us all a little uncomfortable, is, well, first, just look around the room, right? Look around the room, right? The faces that you're seeing, the backgrounds that we come from tend to be relatively homogenous in this world and essentially sort of in this headspace. When you take the average American, the average American city, they can only access 30% of the jobs that they're qualified for via 90 minutes on public transportation. We can do all the economic development we want. We can build all the office buildings we want. We can incentivize companies to come to our cities. But unless we provide fundamentally better mass transit at commute price points that are under $5, we will have done nothing for the most vulnerable and the folks who stand the most to gain from that mobility.
Right.
So Tim, to take your point about suburbs and to get to the underlying point, of those people who do not have access to those jobs because they have to take a car, and Amanda, to get to your point of communities where there's folks who are making $25,000 a year and have 2 cars. When we look at this conversation, it's so easy to point to the sexy stuff, right? The Ubers, the Lyfts, the really cool electric scooters and things like that. But that plays to us, right? That doesn't play to some of the most vulnerable folks in our communities. And at the end of the day, this conversation should be about access, equity, safety, and most importantly, job access. So I want to expand the question a little bit.
And I think like the question of the suburbs, I mean, that's really the problem that we all need to tackle. Right. Because the middle of San Francisco, it's easy to make a transportation service successful. That's absolutely the low-hanging fruit. There's tons of density there. There are a lot of people that don't own cars. Let's look out into the suburbs, 30 miles out, where, frankly, it's not affordable to take a Lyft ride for that entire distance. I think that points to the complementarity of these different options and why you absolutely have to have a multimodal approach. And I don't think it would benefit me to promote Lyft as a sole mode of transportation for people's daily use at a regional level, because nobody's going to take a $35 Lyft ride twice a day to get in and out of the city. Now, I would love to think about how we can evolve our product to facilitate regional commuter carpooling, but frankly, the goal shouldn't be to have people be driving 35 miles. The goal should be to have them take a 2-mile Lyft that gets to a train station where they don't have to park a car, and then get on an arterial rail corridor that brings them into the center city, because that's the most efficient way to transport a large volume of people when you have sufficient liquidity of demand. Right. So I think that's the greatest function that we can play at the regional level, and we're engaged in a lot of really interesting pilot discussions with large transit operators looking at commuter rail at the metropolitan level right now. We're trying to solve that precise problem, because in many cases, there's tremendous demand for rail. It's a great experience. It's so much better than sitting in traffic. If you can have a predictable arrival time, travel, read a paper, or look at your phone while you're, while you're on that vehicle, rather than having to focus on the stop and start and be stuck in traffic. I think a lot of people want access to that, but right now, housing affordability is a huge impediment to access to rail, and the station catchment areas are really not sufficiently large to allow access to a large number of people. So we need to think about flexible peer-to-peer options that can operate in relatively low volume demand areas to feed people into arterial networks. And peer-to-peer is critical to that, because, and I think I've heard Robin Chase say this, so I don't worry too much about offending you, Justin, but it's hard for fleet-based shared mobility services to be successful in low-density suburban environments, which is why you continue to see them in the urban core. And that's why peer-to-peer models can play a complementary role, because they don't require a certain level of utilization in order to be available. Nobody has to make the decision at Lyft, we're going to make a capital outlay to extend service into this low-density area. It just happens because the drivers live there and people request rides, and it can be available at a reliable, convenient level of service, even in an area that can't support other kinds of fixed route or fleet-based services.
Yeah, I do want to just get back to Matt's point if I can. Just yesterday, our team was in Buffalo, New York, and we were at City Hall with the mayor to launch a new service there where we're partnering with the former Buffalo Car Share. 50% of Buffalo Car Share members made $25,000 or less a year. I'll say that again. 50% of Buffalo Car Share members made $25,000 or less a year. Car sharing is an alternative not just for people who choose to live a car-free or car-light lifestyle, but people for whom car ownership is not an option, or car ownership is not a financially viable option, to Amanda's point. Car sharing saves our members $600 a month on average, right? So we know that car sharing has the promise of helping to provide mobility access for people who maybe can't otherwise afford it, and we're incredibly excited to gather some learnings from Buffalo. But we've been doing this in cities like Boston and in Chicago and in New York for many years as we've extended our growth outside the downtown core.
Bob and then Amanda.
So, bike share also, I think, is a solution to help the underserved and to address social equity. If the great thing about an RFID card is all you have to do is get that RFID card in the hands of someone. It's the question of what program do you put behind that card. Right. In Philadelphia, we actually put in a program in place where people can go to a 7-Eleven and pay cash. So if they're unbanked or if they don't have credit cards, they can actually have access to the bike share system. But to get away from the very important topic of social equity for a minute to answer your question, I think the role of bike share, which is a fleet-based system, right, and which we always hear about density, density, density. But the role of bike share, I think, in the suburbs can be dual. One is the last mile solution, right? If it's integrated with transit and we have the stations at bike share stations, and if we put the technology in place even to talk about the horrible, potentially evil thing of reservations, right? That people know there's going to be a bike there when they get off the train. Mm-hmm. That will help drive people riding their bike to the train station if they can use the same card. Mm-hmm. And then in the suburbs themselves, you just need a dense core within that suburb for the bike share fleet to operate independently, I think. And then bike share does play a role in the suburbs.
So before we talk about scaling, I think we need a little more data to understand what are the impacts of these systems. And so at long last, I'm very, very excited to be able to finally announce, drum roll please, that NRDC is going to partner with University of California, Berkeley Transportation Sustainability Research Center to conduct the analysis of the transportation network companies, Lyft and Uber, that I think many of us have been wondering for a long time what is actually happening with these companies. I know I've asked the question many times. I know Susan's asked the question many times. What is actually going on? These companies have come rapidly into the mainstream, but what's happening? I know very personally for myself and my family chose to sell our car, that the availability of on-demand mobility was a factor for us, absolutely. So many people hypothesize Lyft and Uber are allowing people to live in cities without the need to own a car. And I've even heard anecdotally realtors saying that they see the parking demand dropping for the first time in memory in San Francisco because people are willing to use Lyft and Uber instead of owning a vehicle. On the other hand, people have been all day long criticizing yesterday these services potentially for their impacts, for taking people off of transit. So what is actually happening with these systems? What is the climate impact? And NRDC is an organization focused really on climate change. So NRDC is going to partner with UC Berkeley to conduct the first ever true climate analysis of Lyft and Uber. And I'm pleased to be able to share that information with all of you. And my request to all of you, my invitation to all of you, because I think this is really the cream of the crop in terms of this audience, is to be in touch with me and to be in touch with Susan and to give us your ideas about shaping the methodology so that we can put out really the best study possible to really try to answer these questions.
I mean, and to be perfectly clear, this is with the cooperation of our companies. And this is something I'm really so excited to be able to actually have out into the world, because this is a conversation that we started, and it's difficult. As you heard, there's a great desire for data about our platforms. And from a Lyft perspective, we are in a very competitive marketplace. And sharing data publicly is something that's challenging for competitive reasons, but I see an enormous value to us in advancing the science on this and being open with that to trusted researchers who will have the ability to actually analyze data from our platform, who will have the ability to survey our users to understand their behavior, and for us to have openness around that to actually allow this to be documented. I see no reason for us to hold back inquiry on this area. We can serve the public by allowing this to be documented and to start thinking about what role it can play in climate policy.
Absolutely. And these guys are so hard to manage sometimes because they literally stole my next question. So they answered the question. We touched on equity as well, but I want to open up to the audience, but before we do that, I really want to go back, because this was my actual question that I had was, Amanda, you started this discussion about the perverse, infiltration of auto mobility into our entire policy system. And it's maybe a rhetorical question now, but equity, sustainability, and accessibility are so hard to achieve in transportation. It's not impossible. We've just made choices to make it impossible to meet this. And I think it's very important for us to acknowledge that when we talk about shared mobility, we get in this trap sometimes of saying, well, that's for the privileged few, or that's for this, that's for this particular demographic or these people, and that's making a two-tiered system. Well, guess what, folks? We don't have an equal transportation system right now. Right now, you have a choice of driving your own car or being relegated to a second-tier transport service, which is cobbled together by all these different policies and funding programs, which are so hard to operate because we have these perverse incentives. So, Amanda, give me your 30 seconds of how are we going to change this paradigm to make equity, sustainability, and accessibility that much more integrated into the transportation system?
Well, I'll just give you one quick example. We're working in partnership with the City of Los Angeles on a low-income electric vehicle pilot program. This is to bring the cleanest technology we have available into some of the poorest and most polluted neighborhoods. And there are certainly challenges with doing it. I mean, Susan's early research has suggested that, yes, wealthy urban dwellers are some of the first adopters of shared mobility modes. But that's why we feel like it's so important to work through with those who need it most, who are most sensitive to the cost of car ownership and would most willingly shed the vehicle if another option was provided, to work through those issues of the unbanked and low-income communities to provide access to these very compelling new services. And
I think, Matt, to your original point, we do have so many, unlike the European visitors here, who most of your jobs are within that 90-minute shed of public transit, that takes a lot of land use changes, and that takes a lot of time. So what's the advice for the public sector then, who does have the policy levers? What can we do now? Because Bridj is kind of like that opportunity area. What would you like to actually see happen that we can do now?
Is to go back to first principles of saying for every dollar that the taxpayer is giving us, it's the government's responsibility to provide back to the taxpayer the most transit and the most mobility for that dollar. But it has to be done in a way that's safe, regulated, and accessible. We had a general manager of one of the local transportation network companies who stood up at a meeting about ADA transit and said, this TNC doesn't work for everyone, but it works for some. Quote, and it's quoted in the Globe in a couple days. So I think when we look at that, that is really troubling to me, and I think it's really troubling to sort of the governments in the room who want to, at the end of the day, be able to come back and say, well, hey, we need to take the Lyfts of the world, the Bridges of the world, the B-Cycles of the world, Zipcars of the world, the RideScouts of the world, and all integrate them into one common system. And the only way that governments can do that responsibly is to make a basic level playing field of responsible regulation and basic regulation to make sure that things are ADA accessible and safe.
Right. And I think that the thing I want to have in the last speed is the performance outcomes. I think one of the things that we're grappling with cities right now is, and I'm working with a lot of cities around the country and around the world, is how do we understand these common principles? What are these common principles? So I'm sending out an invitation to you all. Many of you live in the Bay Area and work with me. As part of our transportation platform, we're going to have, rather than this combative relationship we've had in the past, we're going to do some urban therapy and say, I feel, therefore, however, and move on from that and actually start talking about what are the city's goals. The city's goals for us are at the bottom in the green. It's ultimately the key performance indicator in this space is reducing car ownership, because we can't grow with more car ownership. It's a geometry thing. It's just not going to happen. We also want to see them use the greenest, quietest fleet. Sound, noise is a real issue in our cities. They have to be green fleets. It has to be safety focused. As long as we are agreeing that safety is the key, and it really needs to add capacity to the network. You can't take capacity from the network. It needs to add capacity to the network. So whether it's public transport and the broader definition of public transport, that's okay. But between the first, second, and third principles of being customer focused, they're already doing that. 10 out of 10 guys, and the RideTap program that was launched in Austin at NACTO. That's fantastic, where you can have Lyft, bike sharing, car sharing, all of that put together now, it's awesome. But we need to work with you on availability and scalability. We need to have those hard public-private partnership discussions, and that's street design. And a lot of that stuff is still mired in the bureaucracy of the federal government. Most of you innovators don't realize that the reason why we can't do really cool stuff in the street, we can do it on the sidewalks, but we can't do it in the street because there's a lot of federal and state regulation that doesn't allow that stuff to happen. It's stuck in the 70s, guys. We need to really break down those policy areas and do what I call policy surgery. You just go in there and figure out what that little tuck is, that nip and cut, and do it so we can move on, because we're not going to get there without those sort of things. So with that, I want to open it to the floor, and I'm going to respectfully ask the organizers that we started 10 minutes late, so I want to buy 5 more minutes if I can. Thank you. All right, so first questions. Raise your hand up. Yes, over there. Where are the roving mics? You guys got to run. Okay. So if I can ask you guys to do me a favor, if you can ask a question, which ends with a question mark, please. And then the respondents respond really in a very brief way. Thanks. Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Sarah. I have a question. There was a lot of talks about policy.
Can you put the mic close to your mouth?
There were a lot of talks about policy and incentives, and there were a lot of mentions, especially for parkings, and getting rid of parkings. I live in a city, I work in the city, I use public transportation, I bike to work. I don't really like driving cars, but I have 9-month-old twins, and I cannot get rid of my car, unfortunately. If I have to go to doctor appointment, I still need that parking space to be available. I really don't have any way around getting rid of that car. So I want to know what's your, I mean, this shared mobility is really good, and I'm very excited about it. But what are we going to do for those people who still need their car because of, and there are a lot of us. Right. What's the way around that to still?
Well, I think that's a perfect opportunity to take a Lyft. One thing I'll say, though, is you probably need car seats. Right? Yeah. So I think there are some little customizations like that. And right. I'm excited to see how, as our supply continues to grow, our ability to offer even more tailored experiences, a vehicle with a bike rack on it for that asymmetrical, bike commuter, and that you're coming home late at night and wants to strap their bike on a car. Someone who needs a car seat. I think there are a few little tweaks like that we can make that's going to open this up for a number of other additional use cases that are really going to make it easy for you not to need that car.
Okay. It sounds like you're getting closer anyway. You're already using public transit, yeah. and you're biking in much the same way that my family does. We only use the car when we need to go together. Most of us use other choices, and so what we're really looking after is those that will only take just their car, a single time a day. How do we break into that large chunk?
I was going to say, you're the ideal citizen. If we can actually have more people like you, we actually don't have a traffic problem.
Yeah, we really don't.
You're not really using it all the time. It's those who need it for every single trip. Right. That's the areas that we have to focus on.
But we don't want her to have to park her car in Boston.
That's right. That's right.
Wherever it may be.
Any more questions? Philip, and then this gentleman here. A question, Philip.
Yeah, Tim, I've got a question for you.
Okay.
Because it seems that one of the issues we're looking at is the coordination of these services in the public space with public transport.
Right.
But do you feel that the MTA, for example, has the right tools in place to coordinate all of this? Are we, as public authorities, not availing themselves the level of control or the level of oversight they require to ensure that public policy outcomes are guaranteed? Especially for new entrants and entrants that don't conform to what not your agency but other agencies are used to dealing with, which is a single operator for a single service.
Right. Yeah, I mean, that's a very good question, and that's where our agency is also evolving as well in our thinking. We started off with this idea of it's one size fits most, right? It's a 40-foot or 12-meter bus, or it's a train, and we've realized that these guys are all showing us it's actually more complex than that. There isn't just one type of commuter. There's a whole bunch of different types of users of the system. And one of the things that I've been focusing on in our agency now is to really make us that platform where we invite the providers to come in and show how they're meeting these goals. And as we're working through this right now, because it's happening in real time, it's even though you can't meet, you say you can't meet these key core principles right now, if you agree with them in concept, that's at least the invitation we can have and maybe do a pilot together and figure out, because as Amanda said, we don't have the data yet to figure out, and many of the cities have already made up their mind on certain things, and we've actually tried to open their minds on how do you actually have these different entities come in, because as the system grows, it's the sum of all, it's greater than the sum of all its parts. And I think that's what the change in policy thinking right now is. We actually do need these services to actually augment the overall experience in the city, so you can get from point A to point B seamlessly. Because right now that's not the case.
And Tim, can I just add on, just from sort of the private sector side, especially with our partnership with Boston, a couple other cities, and now an even more direct partnership with, sort of a couple other cities that we're announcing. Kansas City was the first, where at the end of the day, it's sort of a straw man argument, right? And we're sort of setting this argument up incorrectly by saying, hey, the city is trying to, sort of quash sort of a fleet that they can't inspect, they can't control. And I think one of the things that, is really important is that it's a two-sided sort of equation, that at the end of the day, there's things that the private sector needs to give up. And I'm even hesitant to say give up, because it's so silly. It's not give up. But ensure that there's basic ADA access. Make sure that the vehicles are professionally inspected, not by somebody else who's a driver on the platform, by somebody who's licensed and partially trained at least to provide a vehicle inspection, and to make sure that there are CORI-compliant fingerprint background checks. Like, those are some of the basic fundamental things that we can do to create an environment where, instead of fighting over essentially sort of the edges, we can actually work together to collaborate and prevent a situation like happened between 1950 and 1970, where the petroleum industry ran amok, and we're dealing with those consequences of a lack of regulation and a lack of cooperation, a lack of private sector responsibility for the next 100 years.
I think it's important to respond to that briefly, and I think Matt and I have slightly different views on this.
Slightly different.
So Matt operates a service that is using professional, commercial, full-time driver employees that operate commercial buses, right? And on the other end of the spectrum, you've got a peer-to-peer platform like Lyft, where they're everyday people who are licensed to operate vehicles that are they're already on the roads of all of these jurisdictions, being personally operated, under the inspection and smog check and other kinds of registration rules that exist in those places. And now they're being put into shared use, right? And so there is definitely a role for government to have appropriate public safety regulations, and we've been happy to work around that. But the biggest challenge for us is in the process of allowing someone to become a driver and making sure that that remains accessible for part-time participants.
Absolutely.
Because frankly, if you look at the traditional for-hire vehicle industry, it never expanded to actually become accessible at a regional scale or in many residential communities, because only people who were becoming engaged at a professional level were able to participate, and that constrained the supply of people who could join. And also it sort of created costs, a barrier to entry. If you look at New York City, the black car market there, it costs $3,000 to become licensed as a professional black car driver. And those folks, those are going through the kinds of processes that Matt describes, and maybe that makes sense if that's gonna be your full-time job and your career for a long period of time. But 80% of the drivers on our platform drive for fewer than 20 hours per week. Right. And many of them do it for a very short period of time. And they're accessing it as a form of temporary income or part-time income that's supplemental to other activities that they have. And our goal is actually to even shoot that out farther into the commuters, people who are not doing this as a major form of income, but are doing it just on a casual basis through our driver destination carpool matching feature, where we're actually just pairing people up when they're going somewhere they'd already go. And someone like that is not going to pay hundreds of dollars for a licensing fee to participate, nor are they going to take days off of work to go in and go through a monthly, a very long process of several weeks, right? This is the core of what the conflict has been about, frankly, with regard to our industry, is should there be a different driver onboarding process? And I think what's important, we really want to be a socially responsible company. We want to protect public safety. We also want to expand access to mobility and opportunity for participation. And so I think that's where the dialogue needs to be, and and that's why there's a slight difference in our view there.
Full stop at safety, though. And I think we agree.
Okay. Bob.
So to get, I think to the question of what can cities and transit agencies do to try and integrate all these little services. I mean, Tim's big, right? I mean, the MTA is big. It's like this big ocean liner, right? And we're like all these little speedboats that are going around, right? He needs data. We don't need data. We're just doing it, man. He needs the data. Right. We're just already doing it. So I think, what Tim said is right, and that is it's the intent of the transit agencies and the cities. We're turning the big ship, right? right now, we're all these little boats buzzing around the ship. Pretty soon, we're all going to be in the wake of that big ship, if I can push the metaphor. And it's really the intent, but with transit agencies and cities, it takes a long time to make that change, right?
And I want to say I've spent a lot of years just making sure that ship disarms. That is innovation itself. Just disarm and unlock and just let them go by. So this gentleman here was first, yeah. You sir, here.
So my name is Dick Mudge from Compass Transportation. And first of all, I'd like to commend the panel and yourself for actually, the first time other than Ed Glazer, who recognizes that cities are part of a metropolitan area.
Right.
That changes things. There's been a strong emphasis, and you mentioned it, and I've heard it before, that short trips are good. Right. The implication, I guess, is that long trips are bad. I have two comments about that. One is it sounds very elitist. Number two, I think it's bad economics. And I'm a card-carrying economist. But if I'm a businessman, I want to have access to the best possible job, labor, any place in the metropolitan area, not just those who happen to be in walking distance. And if I'm an individual...
Let me clarify that for you. So when we say city of short trips, the work trip is 20% of the total trips, and that doesn't count part of that. The everyday amenities is the short trips.
Okay, but I guess the question I have is there... and if I'm an individual, I want to have access to the best possible job, regardless of where it is. Is that something that it's hard for me to see that people sitting around the table up there, that their business models will serve most of that, because most jobs are not in the CBD.
Right.
Is that something we just need to recognize that will have to be served by private individual cars, by autonomous vehicles, or whatever?
I mean, but don't make it, I mean, sort of the average trip on we just redid the numbers. I mean, the average trip on the Bridj system is 21 minutes. Some are considerably longer, some are considerably shorter. So, I mean, Boston's a weird animal, right? Because there's, sort of a bunch of towns surrounding essentially sort of the core of Boston. But, we're serving a number of different municipalities, and we are serving essentially sort of those long trips. Emily and I had a great conversation a couple months ago that was facilitated by RMI about what can, essentially sort of a system like Bridj do in cooperation with sort of a system like Lyft, because we serve very different sort of mode cases. So I think the way to think about it, and you're absolutely correct, is expanding that definition and saying one size doesn't fit all. But as Tim said, the system and the platform does fit all.
Transit agencies have had a really limited set of tools in the tool belt for a long time. You said for the 40-foot bus or a train, right? And that only meets certain circumstances. If it comes near you, that's great. If it doesn't, you're just going to drive your car because there wasn't anything else. Now we have the spectrum of microtransit and other shared mobility options that are able to meet a much broader set of use cases. And I think that that's why we'll be able to deploy different things into different areas that can holistically meet this need. But it's not going to be the same service in every area. Sure. We're going to be able to operate in some places that don't have the density for Bridj. Bridj is going to be more affordable than Lyft in many instances in more dense areas, and people will choose that. So there's going to be picking and choosing based on what meets the need.
So the key is about choices. Yes. Yeah.
I think the issue is you've identified mass transit is where it's at, and you need to have that corridor and the cost of mass transit. What do we do to get the cost of mass transit down? Because that can provide a lot of the services that we're looking for.
Yeah, so one thing we can do is remove the subsidies for automobiles. That will reduce the cost of public transit. The reason why transit costs what it costs is because it's stuck in traffic because we don't give it priority, number one. Number two, it costs what it costs because we've made car driving so cheap. And so when you remove the economists in the room, when you remove subsidies, people respond to price signals. So we haven't priced the system accordingly. And that's why we're over-subsidizing. So we've subsidized the automobile and its infrastructure, and we're over-subsidizing the public transport system because it actually doesn't make economic sense. It doesn't make sense, right? So if you remove that initial subsidy, now all of a sudden the demand actually makes sense, the fare box recovery goes up, and now we can actually have some discussions there. We're not even going to talk about the labor issue, which is 70% of the operating costs of public transit right now. Labor, pensions, wages, and benefits. So that's an opportunity area for autonomous technology. Yes, sir, over here. I saw a lot of nods when I said that. So it's a tough group.
I want to hear more about the big announcement that Amanda just made. So please tell us more about the data that you are thinking about working with.
It's exciting.
Great. Yeah, great. So some of the questions we're hoping to get at are around vehicle ownership and whether there's been, we're going to do original research, new research, a survey of the users of these platforms, and try to understand questions about vehicle ownership, vehicle miles traveled, mode shift, relationship to transit, whether people are, what people would have done if the Uber or Lyft trip wasn't available. Would they have walked? Would they have biked? Would they have taken transit? Would they have driven? Would they have taken a taxi? Susan did maybe some of you have seen, Susan did a very, very preliminary sort of sketch analysis a couple of years ago, but it didn't have really nearly the data size, the sample size we need to have to draw any conclusions. So those are the kinds of questions we really want to get at. We also want to understand some better socio-demographic data about who's using the services, who they're available to, and those kinds of things.
Yeah, and I think for us, for the cities, we know that it's very contentious. You know, these companies are growing and they're expanding. It's a competitive advantage to share data. And if they do share data with us as a city, it becomes publicly available. And we know there's a lot of issues because companies are competing and they want to access that data to reverse engineer what they're doing to compete with them. So our position has been in my group is we need a third-party verifier. Every time every industry says we have X percentage of this and that, there's always an asterisk at the bottom, verified by so-and-so, right? Mm-hmm. So when they make their statements, hopefully through this partnership, we can just say, is this legit? And Susan can say, looks good to me, so we can say great, and I can shout up from the rooftop.
Susan would just have a sign that goes green or
Susan
red.
approved.
Yeah. Up or down, you know. Our 50% of all trips are carpool, good. You know, our 20% of all trips from transit, good. You know, there's that sort of stuff. So, okay, magical last question, Jerry. No, thank you for your patience because we actually ran out a little bit of it, but it's
Jerry Tierney, Perkins and Will. I want to change it over somewhat to a land use question here, and it kind of addresses what this gentleman was talking about, the regional basis. And I'm wondering if we need a kind of a blue state reality check here, because in the Bay Area, we had the San Francisco MTC put out the One Bay Area plan. And it was town hall meetings were held all around the Bay Area. I remember going to one out in Dublin in Alameda County, at which the police had to be called because the Tea Party turned up. And this happened again in Santa Rosa and also down in San Jose. This is in the Bay Area, for God's sakes. You know, this is about as blue as it's going to get. And we already had a reaction to a plan which was trying to be as benign as coordinating land use policy and transportation. In other words, have the land use appropriate to where the transportation infrastructure was. So I'm asking here, do we need a kind of a reality check? Is there a culture change we need to be working on as well?
Absolutely. This is not a technical issue. It's almost not a political issue right now. It's a cultural issue. And many people in the room have viscerally reacted to the statements that we've made because, as Amanda said, this goes all through our DNA as a society. And for us to tweak that out, it's going to be a bit of change. And that culture change conversation is really valuable, and I welcome all of you who are in the marketing behavioral change space to think about what's the right way to message this and how do we actually get this to become an enticing, inviting, interesting way to participate, because if it's the don't do this approach, it doesn't work. No one likes being told what to do. No one likes being told by their partner what they should and shouldn't do, right? We want an invitation. So we have to change the culture of how we communicate these benefits and these programs.
Although one thing to add to that, earlier this year, I think in August or September, I spoke on a panel about this subject at the National Conference of State Legislatures with a panelist from the Reason Foundation. What is more American than more choices, fundamentally? I think that this is the kind of innovation that I think you could see have bipartisan resonance.
That's absolutely true. I mean, the political coalition that is supportive of shared mobility is extraordinarily broad. I mean, as someone who's spent a lot of my career working in progressive politics, it's a little bit surreal to me, you know, that libertarians on the far end of the spectrum, as well as people like you, Amanda, are jointly sort of looking at advancing these kinds of options. And I go to places like last week I was in Nashville, Tennessee. Tennessee is a very conservative environment, but consumers are changing what policymakers care about in this regard, because you have massively growing population in places in the Southeast where there never has been traditional transit infrastructure. And there's a need for providing the kinds of experiences that people want. Even in those environments, people are moving into cities. And their elected officials are being called upon to make sure that there are actually options that can move people around and mitigate congestion. So I think there's a political opportunity here.
Yeah, and I couldn't agree. We're in red states, we're in blue states. You know, we're fortunate that we don't require government support for our business model. We're a free market innovation, right? But I do think you're absolutely right that if we want to accelerate the growth of car sharing, for example, we need to do that in partnership with government. And I think we're fortunate that we've reached critical mass. The data is on our side. And for folks on the other side of the political persuasion from me, numbers and data are incredibly compelling, right? And so I think now that we have some solid, sustainable research that proves the benefit, proves the impact, and can show that free market with government getting out of the way in many cases will enable further growth, I think is the key to victory.
So to wrap this up, I think the key next step for us really here is the data is really key. But the data is just one of it. Without data, you have anecdotes, and anecdotes are really dangerous, right? So with data, you actually can now tell the story, and we need to become better storytellers because people like to hear stories, right? So I'll leave it at that. I want to thank the panel for their great work. I want to thank you guys for coming here at 8:30. That was amazing on a Friday. So give yourselves a round of applause, and I'm going to leave it over to Greg. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Tim. Unfortunately, Tim stole half your coffee break, so we're going to take a quick 15-minute coffee break and come back for back-to-back sessions. Don't miss my panel full of idiots at 10:30, and then we're going to power through till lunch. So quickly recaffeinate and come back for 10:30 start.